My my mother and my father were both brought up in just outside Rawalpindi. They were obviously Indian when they were born, and then after partition they became Pakistanis. It's amazing what a line does, a border does. And then my father was just from a family of farmers really. Just had a bit of land and they ate from it, made a bit of money from it, and that's it. And then my father was really interested in educating himself, moved from there, moved to Karachi, then my mum moved to Karachi, and then from Karachi he borrowed some money and ended up coming to London himself. We stayed in Pakistan. He then left London, went to Bradford, worked in some mills. I mean, he was really educated, but he couldn't get a job, and a job which, you know, was equivalent to his education, and just worked in the mills, sent back some money to my mum when he eventually saved up, and brought over me and my other brother and my mother. Moved straight to Bradford. I had another two sisters and a brother who were born here. My father was just a bus conductor for like 20 years, and then he bought a little shop. And then he bought another business, had to get rid of the shop, bought another taxi business, and stopped that. And then he'd just be working for the community, like interpreting at courts and things like that, helping out people who were having problems with language and things like that for his own community, and that's it really. And my mum was always a housewife. The earliest type of music that I actually can remember, that I recall being in, kind of like listening to, I can remember was probably the Beatles, and then it was just pop culture, pop as in what was on TV. And then I got into things like the Osmonds, Bay City Rollers, and then from there getting into Deep Purple, the old Queen stuff, Tubular Bells and all that stuff. And then then I can remember my brother just like kind of changing. He was older than me, and he was changing, and he suddenly, like, I found out he got into punk, and I thought, what a weirdo. And then this was like in middle of '76 when it first came off, and about 6 months later, probably at the end of '76 or beginning of '77, I can remember I was like just doing some work and picked up one of the, I think it was a Clash record or a 999, and I just put it on, and just what I heard, I was just like, wow, this is brilliant. It's just like mad punk music, the Clash, or I think, I think it was a Clash, and I just fell right really deeply into punk, and there was kids at school. There was about 2 or 3 who were into it as well, and suddenly, like, I went to school the day after, and I was like, I'm a punk, and that's it. I think I heard the rebelliousness of it, and it's not to say that I was brought up in a really strict background, like a strict Muslim background, because I think it was disciplined, but it was quite liberal and not oppressive. So my father was totally shocked because he'd given us a lot of kind of freedom, and then suddenly his 2 sons just turned into like punk rockers, his eldest sons, and he had a high standing within the community, helping out people, and with immigration problems and things like this. And suddenly, like, it was Mr. Qureshi's sons who were like these rebels who got long hair and spiky hair and walking around and things like, walking around in a real state. And through that punk music, I think there was always a need for me to be in a band. I always romanticised about being in a band. I think it's from the Osmonds days or Bay City Rollers, and I think the whole philosophy of punk is that you didn't really need to play any instrument. You didn't need to play it. So I think, that made me get a few of my friends together, start forming bands, stealing money from my dad's shop till to buy like all the equipment, even for kids who were in the band who couldn't really be bothered about buying anything, but I'd buy it just because I wanted the band so badly. And I was just into it 100%. I was just like into it blindly, and upset my parents quite a lot. But I kind of balanced it out by not, smoking drugs or taking alcohol, only eating the right food that I was being brought up to for. So I kind of personally I balanced it all out. I think in the early days, I recall. There used to be there used to be like 4 or 5 Asian punks around. There used to be a band called Monochrome Set, and there was a guy in there, Biddu or something like that, who was a singer. He was half Indian. And then there was a few other just normal kids around on the scene who was like in bands but not doing much. I can remember when we used to travel around to some gigs, we'd actually meet up with a few punks from London, Asian punks from Harrow and things like this, but there weren't many around. But it was almost like being in that scene didn't really matter what colour you were. It wasn't until later on in that scene where it mattered what colour you were. And but initially, it slowly built up. I think at one time in Bradford anyway, there was probably about 20 Asian punks, but that was later on, probably in like 81, 80. I was so into the concept of forming a band, and eventually through all the little bands that we'd had, Violation, and my brother was in a band called Plastic Bucket and the Abortions, and then from that, I remember I was also into promoting bands. We'd run punk clubs, me and my brother, and I put on a band called Crass and Poison Girls, and through that this guy just turned up who was travelling with him called Ian Asbury, and eventually he ended up staying at a friend's house and stayed in Bradford, and we'd seen him around a few times, and one of the kids in the band really liked the way he was like dressed and carried himself. We just eventually asked him to join a band, and that became the Southern Death Cult, which then became the Death Cult, and then became the Cult, and now is no more. But it was just like, in them days, it was just punk days, and it was brilliant, and the whole Southern Death Cult thing, it only had a lifespan of like 18 months from when it began to when it ended, but it caused a big, on the underground scene anyway, there was a lot of people into it, and a lot of people were like, a lot of record companies were chasing after us, a lot of press were after us, and try to check out what we were about. And in them days, as much as I wasn't kind of political consciously, I think I was unconsciously, but Ian was into the whole Native American politics and how they'd been messed up by the Americans, the white Americans. And I can remember that group just growing. People like Pete Townsend would turn up at gigs, and Bono would turn up at gigs, and before U2 even were that big, loads of people would be out hanging around at gigs, and then as quickly as it formed and gained momentum, it just like stopped as well. It packed up. There was like differences within the band, usual differences, and Ian went his way, I went mine, and the other three went our way, and went our ways. We formed other bands, got involved in big record companies like RCA, Warner Chappell, started experiencing from a big indie label to a big major record company. All the time we were just managing, self-management. And then eventually that group, which was called Getting the Fear, which was named after Charles Manson's thing. And then we set up Nation Records after moving down to London from Bradford. The positive elements of punk, personally for me, was the philosophy of anti-establishment, breaking stereotypes, getting, just thinking for yourself, just being responsible to yourself, really. The negative side was obviously, like a lot of English people were just involved in it for the fashion and the trend, and they didn't really feel the vibe of it. Some of them did, I'm not saying everyone. But, and I just carried that kind of philosophy and open-mindedness because I was learning. I learnt more from punk than I did at school because I was interacting with a lot of people, communicating with a lot of more people, talking about issues that, that really concerned and, which I hadn't really drawn an opinion on but concerned me. So, because you'd be hanging out with older people as well, and hippies and, Hell's Angels and Satan slaves and bikers, they'd all be in the same kind of clubs. So you'd get involved in conversations and learn about all these different, people, and a lot of them were into politics and, sort of some form. They were obviously older than us, so they'd started off at a rebellious trend as well. So we just, that was the positive and the negative sides of it. I think, if I wouldn't have got into that, I don't think I'd be doing what I was doing now. And I still carry that kind of attitude of, not working within certain parameters. It's breaking all the parameters, breaking them, creating a new parameter, and then breaking that as well, and always try to break things. I mean, the problem is that I'm not a talent. I don't have a talent. I'm not talented as a musician, but I think as just like trying to create something now with technology, it's possible what's in your head to create it on some of the machines that we use. So that's helped me out. When we were involved in the punk scene, contrary to popular myth that it was only that scene that we were involved in a lot of the reggae scene. If you remember that The Clash and a lot of other punk bands were influenced by a lot of reggae and the production values of it and the experimentation of it. And some of the bands that we'd be in, we were in Lum Lane, which is the famous red light district in Bradford, where all the Pakistanis live and things like that. And there was a reggae shop there, and we'd rehearse underneath the reggae shop, and we'd be hanging out with Rastas or different people from different parts of the community all the time. So we were always being kind of we were always having these different musical cultures thrown at us. We weren't just one, just of listening to one type of music. You had the Oi movement came across, and there was the Gothic movement. All these little trends were all branches of punk rock which came off, and I think when people talk about hip hop and rap, and they think it started at a certain time, I don't know, 82 or 83 or whatever, I don't know when it actually started. I think hip hop and its message has been around well before that. I think that all the old, black artists in America were, they were all talking about politics even before Elvis Presley, the chain gang stuff and things like this. So I think it was always political, but the industry wouldn't allow them politics to be heard. So it was more of like a private thing. Only some people got it. Or a lot of black artists would kind of turn it around and make it a bit clever to just talk about something which meant something else, but not many people would cotton on to it. So when things like, obviously, Public Enemy made, it was the right time, and the right time, the right place, and the whole kind of, there was a resurgence in black politics. and black awareness after a bit of a, I think, a quiet period. Or maybe just people had just had enough and that was it. I mean, I think in the context of America, politics, black and white politics, it's gone right over the fence. It's jumped over that fence, and it's a lot more dirtier to a certain extent, and it's a lot more reactionary, and there's a lot more divisions. But that's not the fault of the black people of America. It's the fault of the white power system in America, who hasn't done anything about the past. So we walked into the Empire Ballroom, saw all these like Asian kids going absolutely mad, and just reminded me of the old days, punk days. And I think it's obviously because you have some connection to some of them people. They're Asian and things like this, and you just think, wow, this is what I've seen. But the bands you don't really like because they're a bit tacky, failed Elvis Presley kind of types, a bit cabaret. But you listen to the rhythms, and the rhythms are brilliant, and you're just going, yeah. I want to mess up these rhythms, or just have the rhythm going in a club. So the whole idea about Nation was to take Asian music, but also a lot of other types of music, world music, and just make them interact and try to be like really clever about it, but really natural as well, and just make them all interact and deliver something onto the dance floor for young people who would just be, flooded with all these different types of sounds coming from different parts of the world, and just create a real chaotic kind of music with a dance element. World music had existed, experimentation had existed well before Nation, and done quite well, but it was more like a bit snobby and a bit for over 35, 40-year-olds, and it was like, we just wanted to really mess it up and make it street vibey. And if you listen to a lot of hip hop and rap records now, they've got a lot of Asian vibes in them. Asian music's coming in, little bits of sitar just like looped over and things like this. It's just creating new vibes. So I think it was the Empire Ballroom. That was it. That's what started it all off. And then we built up the stable, got give people a lot of freedom, because I was quite lucky, because as an artist, you know what you need from a record company. It's not always money, it's just the freedom to be artistically creative and things like that. And that was given. We didn't have much money, so we couldn't give much money out. We could just afford to pay for studios and people to get on. And Fuse One came out, and it had people like Talvin Singh, Jar Wobble, David Harrow, Sapana, Natasha Atlas. So all these people who were really interested in like different music from different parts of the world. I think as Nation kind of began, we already were aware that, like say in the East End, there was people like Joy around, and State of Bengal who was doing things, and there was a few others. And then just as it evolved, then it was like you found out there was more actually Asian people, for some unknown reason, around London or inside London, just involved in a lot of music. And then we started like looking after Talvin management and like trying to get him really working with a lot of people and things like this. And we just kept on coming across with all these other people who were already doing things and being really political. I mean, Joy were really political when they first started, they still are, but they don't talk about it as much, but or they're not given the opportunity. And then at the same time, Public Enemy was happening and all that stuff. And then there was, I went across to America once, and I just like met up with, just saw some black Muslims on the streets talking about what they were going through and things like this. And there were a lot of things that they were talking about which I kind of like identified with, because I'd gone through it, but I didn't know how to verbally talk about it. But these people were expressing something that was inside me. They were expressing it verbally out on the street in front of everybody. And I came back and I just thought, we need an Asian kind of vibe group which is really political and talks about the same kind of things. And I tried getting people like Talvin and all that stuff to form something, and they wouldn't. And then eventually I just thought, well, it doesn't matter. I'll just try getting something to you know, I just got my head around samplers and things like this. And then within 5 days, you know, somebody said, oh, there's Notting Hill Carnival. And we said, oh, let's just get these people together. Got Inda, who I knew from Bradford, who was a tabla player. Khalid, who was a DJ, but he was a good friend and I'd grown up with, who also knew Lalaman, who was a rapper. And we just said, okay, let's form a quick group and let's form it Notting Hill Carnival and make it really hard politically, and of all these sounds of Asian and hip hop and rock and punk and all that stuff, just crash them together. So within 5 days we formed the band, went and played at Notting Hill Carnival, and it was just like, you know, we had all these speeches of Farrakhan and things like this, you know, like really big pieces to get across what we wanted to get across. I mean, you know, it wasn't whether we agreed with Farrakhan in his whole big scheme of things. It was just like he seemed to verbally say what we felt. So, so we took them pieces, and just the whole impact of that first gig was like, you know, people just stood around, everyone, white, black, or whatever, stood there and they were just like, what's going on here? It was like the performance was really mad and things like this. And then eventually, I think the police came up. You know, the police were there, and it was like the atmosphere got a bit tense. And then we just came off and we just felt brilliant that we just like let out some of this frustration, and it just kind of grew from there really. So that was in 1991, but it didn't quite get back together till 1992, and then we started getting first lot of records, and the only record company that, you know, at that time I can remember, I even didn't want it on Nation. I wanted to get it on Island Records or something like that, and they weren't interested. So the only record company who were interested was our own, and it was just like, let's do it here. I think that without Nation being there, through my experience of being in other bands before, it wouldn't have been able to function. It wouldn't have been able to set up. So we just started releasing records, and people. There was the Salman Rushdie affair going on, which was like quite, you know, a lot of bad vibes going on there. So we like kind of decided to dig a hole and be on one side, but try to also say that, you know, the other side wasn't, you know, we weren't getting enough. People needed to discuss and debate the whole issue. There was a big gap. There was a grey area which people weren't talking about, and the media wasn't talking about. And you know, it just straight away profile came, controversy came, radical, militant, the usual things that, you know, the white media throws against black people who are talking about injustices and things like that. Bosh. And then it just kind of grew from there. And, you know, we didn't really care about selling too many records or anything like that. We just wanted to be really, really strong on what we had to say and what we'd been through and what we'd experienced. And, you know, and you know, here was like kind of 4 Asian guys at that time just going absolutely mad, which had been not, you know, even our own community couldn't deal with that, because it was a performance. Again, it was punk. It was mad, you know, mad on stage. So, you know, therefore, it's kind of always appealed to more of like the left-wing, white, subversive, anti-establishment people, you know, and a handful of eclectic Asians. But that's, you know, you've got to expect that, because that's what you're making. You're experimenting. At the Notting Hill Carnival, I can remember just a really tense atmosphere building, and you could see that whereas bands had been on, a few bands had been on before, and the people were just dancing and happy, and suddenly there was just like, you know, nobody was dancing, probably because they thought we were crap or something, I don't know, but people were just like looking, and there was like a lot of people just paying attention, and then every time a speech had start and finish, people would say, yeah, yeah. Yeah, you know, and they'd hear it. And then when we came off stage, people, a lot of like, you know, Afro-Caribbean people just came on going, you know, you said some really good stuff. And it was like, well, we didn't say it, you know, Farrakhan said it. And they said, yeah, we've heard of him and things like this. So I think it was just touching what other people were feeling anyway. And they already knew, you know, we weren't saying nothing new. It's the same some people perceive it as the same whinge, but in a different at a different time. So we're not saying anything new, which is really sad, I think, because we should be after so long, And if things would have been resolved, then we would be saying something new. But we're just saying the same old shit. I think Fundamental played one great function, and that was to say that an Asian outfit can exist on a really extreme level, which helps other people to say, well, if they're doing it that extreme, we can just be a bit more towards the centre, but still be, political. And I think people like, Asian Dub Foundation, Joy, State of Bengal, there's a few more other bands started becoming a lot more political about things. I mean, Apache Indian, when he came up, he didn't want to talk about politics. And then suddenly when politics became at top of the agenda, musically, when the BNP, the British National Party, came to power in Greenwich or whatever, he started like getting on there, on that tip and try to stop things. But that was almost like, as soon as he started getting really political, that was when his career slumped. So... and then we'd go off and like be doing gigs for Anti-Racist Alliance, Anti-Nazi League, Anti-Fascist Action. We'd be doing gigs for all of them, but we wouldn't align ourselves with any of them. That was it, because once you get aligned to a certain group, then you have to work within its parameters. And we didn't want to work with any of the parameters. And I don't think a lot of the other Asian acts wanted to work. They just wanted to help them along and be visual in the fight against racism, but they didn't want to be a part of any specific group. And we'd all go and do gigs and and I think we were because we were quite extreme, we'd get a lot of the profile, and that'd obviously help other bands to, we'd be giving name checks to everybody and saying there's other bands there's other bands, there's not just us or not just them. And this scene has been existing for ages. And that scene, it's almost like 8 or 9 years old anyway. And people, it still hasn't arrived. People still haven't accepted it. But I think that's because, the majority of people here are just not used to having Asian people as role models. If that's what you want to achieve. I think that'll take another 5-6 years before they can just look at us as musicians and not of Asian and think, oh, they've got a chip on their shoulder or whatever. It's the same thing as reggae, and the black side of music, the Afro-Caribbean side of music. We're just going through the same kind of, it's the same train. I think when you look at Asian music, the things that have kind of created, a lot of noise are obviously, it's like that everywhere actually. It's when you start hitting the charts. If you look at people like Bali Sagu and Babylon Zoo and things like that, it's fine. It's good that there's people there because that's what them people want out of it. But there's also a great underground scene, which has been going on for a long time, Talvin and things like that, which, I think that's where the spirit is. And I think all that other Babylon Zoo and Bali Sagu, they could so easily just be white pop musicians. Wouldn't make any difference. They don't want to be political or talk about things. And I think it's really important right now to be radical. If radical for the future, because what we've got to do is sit down and say, okay, well, we're all artists now doing it, but we ain't going to get the breaks that we'd like to have. But what we've got to do is create the breaks for the next lot of Asian musicians who arrive and make sure that they've got a great platform to leap off. And that's all I expect. I don't expect anything else out of Fundamental. I know that what we're saying now is what we said yesterday, we'll say it tomorrow. Things are not changing. Things won't change. But the more radical we are, the better it'll be for 4 or 5 years' time. Nation Records now is almost 10 years, and me and Kath have been running it. And I think it's like ducking and diving. You know, we've never really never broken even on records that we've put out. We've almost put 100 out. There's been a few which have like, you know, sold quite a lot and made us quite, made us balance the books. It's just financial, and see how far you can flex. And sometimes you have money and sometimes you don't, and you're always like, you know, thinking, oh, can I, you know, we've always looked at 6 months ahead. We've never looked beyond that. I think that's what's helped us survive. And it's purely kind of financial. It depends how much you can flex. But that goes for every independent label. I think, you know, we've had some big deals with people as well. Transglobal has been probably the biggest act we've ever had on Nation. Sounds a bit cliched, but it's just I think we've made a little niche, and it's holding on to that niche. You know, there's a resurgence again of Asian, the underground on the Asian side. You know, but we've been doing it for like 10 years now, and you know, it's just like, well, we've got to be there, but we've got to move it like 2 steps ahead now. We've got to be 2 steps ahead of even that, experimentally, creative-wise. Just because you enjoy it, because I'd hate to be working anywhere else. I couldn't do anything else. You know, even if it came down to just being one person running Nation, that's what it'd have to be. Can't do anything else. I've tried other things. You know, music's there, and you got to carry on doing it. Or just move into the political field. That's the only other alternative. And I don't really see any peace in that. At least here we can express things and create things and be as vocal without being controlled. So, you know, we're breaking them parameters all the time. And that's what keeps you going.